Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder, and welcome to my second video in this Intro to Express playlist. Okay, so in this video, what we want to do is discuss routing. Okay, routes. So basically, routes are how we tell our server to respond, okay, to specific requests. So let's go back to our server.js. And let's actually start like kind of commenting our code. It makes it a lot easier to work in your code if we put some comments. So we'll sit here, we'll put these are our dependencies. Here we will put our listener. This is our listener. And you always want this at the bottom, so when we work here in the middle. And basically, we're going to have our middleware here and our routes here. Okay, and just the way to think about it, the reason you want the listener at the bottom is because the listener is going to, basically your code will read all the middleware and routes first, have it all in the computer's memory before it actually starts listening for any requests. Okay, because if I put the listener first, there's a chance that a request comes in like right away before the middleware and the routes have been actually read into memory, which could cause that request to not be handled properly. So by putting the listener at the end, I know that the computer's already read the rest of the code before it ever starts listening for requests. Okay? And essentially what happens every time a request comes in, your server runs that request through several functions. That's all the server does. Okay, it just says, okay, a request came in, pass it to this function, pass it to this function, pass it to this function. And every function that happens between that request coming into your server and that request getting a response is referred to as middleware. Okay? So routes are really just a special type of middleware that actually gives a response. Okay? And really, you can actually have middleware in your routes. So it gets, everything is essentially, think of it as like a what do you call that when you do like a relay race? Where one function does a job, then that request gets passed on to another function and it becomes sort of cumulative. So you can create all sorts of weird paths of how that request travels through your server. That's kind of what's going on at the end of the day. So we're going to keep it real simple. We'll just make one route. And the way you do it is here in the main file, we're just going to use app.get. Okay, app.get. Then that's a function, and it gets two main arguments. The URL of the route. So we're going to say the URL is slash, which means the root. Okay, the base URL. Okay, so essentially what that means is that this is the base, this is the URL. Okay, so slash would just mean this. That's slash, that's the root. Okay, so that would be what this route tells us. So we're saying that if a request comes in, that's a get request, because there's different verbs, get, post, put, delete. If it specifically requests for a get request for this URL, then do this. You create a function, and the function always receives two things, request and response. Okay, usually abbreviated as rec and res. Okay. Okay, and what this function will do is just determine what happens. So the easiest thing you can do is just send the response using the send function, and we can just send back a string saying, you've gotten a response. You have received a response. Not the most exciting response, but a response nonetheless. So let's try that out. Okay, so type in npm run dev. Let's run our dev server. So it's listening on 3000. I go back to the browser. I go back to localhost 3000. I have received the response. Easy. Okay, and then res has a bunch of different functions you can use. Okay, so these request and response object are pretty useful. Okay, so res response generally has helper functions that allow you to send data. The simplest one is send. Okay, send will determine based on what you give it what kind of response you're sending and try to send it with the appropriate headers. What you don't see, which saves you a lot of time, is that generally when servers communicate with each other, you're supposed to send a bunch of headers. Okay, So let me show you what I mean. So if I go back here in the browser, I hit refresh, I then Control-Shift-I, I go to network here in the DevTools. Let me just do that again, response. So we see there's that, here's the request from localhost. Okay, the response was, you have received response. But you see here, there's all these headers that are sent back and forth. So there's headers that are request sent, because our browser knew to send these headers of information, so the server can do its job. And then it sent us back headers to tell the browser what did the server do. So there's different headers depending on what kind of data you send, for authentication and authorization. There's also different headers. So luckily we don't have to think about that because Express handles that for us. So here it's just like now, because the browser doesn't know what type of data you sent unless it's in the header. So it basically, our server is going to say it's text. But if I put in an object here, okay, and name Alex Merced, age 35, Express is going to assume that you want this to be turned into JSON data. So it'll actually send it back as JSON. So now if I go back over here to the server, and notice that every time I save, Nodemon restarts the server. That's what Nodemon's doing for us. It's not like Node that runs the server and doesn't look for file changes. Because the problem is, once we make a change to the file, the server needs to be restarted before those changes actually take effect. Nodemon's going to be restarting the server anytime I make a change and I save. Okay, so I go to localhost 3000 again, and see now I'm receiving JSON data. Okay, and see, like, look at the response header. See, it added a header that said this is JSON data, application JSON. That wasn't there before, because before we just sent text. So send is a kind of a dynamic function. It'll kind of figure out what you're trying to do. Okay, you could also be explicitly saying you want to send JSON by just doing res.json. Okay, and then it'll send whatever you put in there as JSON. There's also res.render, which is first rendering templates. That's generally, you're probably better off creating an API, sending data as JSON, and creating a separate front-end application that'll consume that JSON data instead of building your front end in React using templates. I mean, in Express using templates. You can do that. There's all sorts of templating engines, Express React Views, Handlebars, Pug, EJS, and they give you ways to kind of dynamically create a website from the server side, but it's not always the fastest, best user experience. There's a place for it, but you should be picky. Okay, ideally you really want to have as much of your website be static, and then what's not static should be client side rendered. And if you have to, if it can't be static and it can't be client side rendered, then you have it rendered on the server. Because rendering on the server is always going to be sort of the slowest, most server intensive thing you can do. Client side, nothing really happens until it's already loaded on the user's computer, so it's a little bit faster, and then the burden's on the user's computer. And then static, well, it's just a static page. There's no rendering. It's just a basic HTML file. So in that case, that's fast for everybody. Okay, so there are tools like Next.js, which kind of has Express built into it, that allows you to kind of take a benefit of all sides of that. Client side, static, and server side rendering. It's a really cool framework in the React world. If you're in Vue, the equivalent would be Nuxt.js. If you're using Svelte, then Sapper, which they do that. But getting an appreciation for backends first before you, and getting, basically you want to know how to use that framework, that front end framework, and then learn how to use like Express. And if you know those two things, then that framework is going to become really valuable to you. Cool. Okay, but that's how you create a route. And then the thing is that you don't have to it doesn't have to be one line. You can do as much logic here as you want. So you can, in this section here, you can go grab data from databases, go grab data from another API, do whatever you want to grab whatever data you want to send back as a response. Okay, but that's what the res object does. It just sends a response. So my advice is generally to be using res.json or res.send, unless you really want to do templating. Watch my videos on like Express React Views or EJS. I do have videos where I use both as templating engines, but I will not be doing that in this particular video series. I'm going to be focusing on just the fundamentals of Express and some API building, which technically we're already doing. We've already created an API endpoint. Okay, I'm already pulling in data that I can go now pull in via like fetch from a front-end application. Cool. But how about this request object? What can I get from here? Okay, I could actually get the headers from there. So let's console log stuff from rec. Console.log rec.headers. Okay, so now let's refresh to open up the console. We'll refresh the page. And if I go here in the browser, now console logs that happen on my server.js, notice it doesn't show up here because that code doesn't get run in the browser. So it doesn't show up in the browser console. It gets run on my server. So it's showing up on my browser terminal or my terminal. And see, this is like the headers, the rec.headers. See, there's all this stuff that's inside the headers. You might not use this too much until you start getting into like authentication, but it's there. Another thing you can do is let's create another route. Okay, and I'm going to create what's called a URL param. Okay, so basically we're going to have a part of the URL that's just static, so cheese. So it's looking for a URL that starts with /cheese. But then after that, we're going to put in a colon, and we're going to use the word param. Okay, so this is called a URL param. Anytime I put that colon, param is not what the URL needs to look like. It's a variable for that section of the URL. So whatever is after cheese goes into this variable called params. So let's take a look. Okay, so there's really two things you can do here. Console.log rec. Because this is part of the request, so rec.params. So we'll start with that. Okay, so if I go to localhost /cheese, it's whatever is after cheese, that's the param. Okay, and actually even better, let's just send back params in that route. So let's send back an object, and inside that object we're going to have params, which is going to equal rec.params. We'll add some other stuff to it later, and let's actually have headers, which equals rec.headers. So we're starting to see all the different things inside the request object. Headers, why is it not like that? Oh, I have to put a comma over here. Save. So now if I go to cheese /joker, okay, it could be anything. So see the param, and notice, see, it's a param that's actually called param. Okay, it's whatever you call it in the thing. And there's my headers. So you see I can send back the request as JSON data. Now I could change this, and again, it doesn't have to be called param. I can call this Gouda. Okay. So still Joker. So I still have Joker in that spot of the URL. Okay, but see, now it's Gouda equals Joker, not param equals Joker. Okay, so the key is determined by what I call the param, and then the value is determined by what's inside the URL in the user's browser. And that's just one way for us to send information to a particular route so it can do things dynamically, like show a particular user's information, okay, or show a particular type of post. Then there's another object, so we're called a query. So there's another way we can hide stuff in the URL called a query, and that would be in rec.query. Okay. And the way you do that is at the end of the URL, so not another slash, you put a question mark. That's when you know anything from the question mark going forward is a query. And you put keys and values. So I'll just put, say, hey, what equals okay, and we'll say my name equals Alex Merced. When you want to do spaces, you have to put %20. and my age equals 35. So see, I put 3 queries in here. Now when I hit enter, and we see that query here under query. So rec.query has anything that's inside the URL query. Params has any params that I defined. So again, any variables I defined in the way the URL looks like. And then headers has just any headers that came in. Okay, so those are probably the 3 main ones you'll use. That's the information that comes in via the request. And then res.send, res.json are the functions we have to send a response. And that all occurs within a route. Okay, and again, the route is only run if the verb matches and if the URL matches. Okay, so if they don't match, it doesn't happen. So like notice it didn't do this. It just skipped this because that URL did not match this. Cheese/Joker does not match this, but cheese/Joker does match this because again, this is a variable catcher. This could literally be anything. But you can also create routes for other types of verbs. So app.post, app.put, app.patch, app.delete. So whatever kind of HTTP request you want there to be a response to, you can do that. You can even do app.all, which will respond to any verb to that URL. Okay? So you can do that when making your requests. And with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. In the next video, we'll take this a step further and start introducing the idea of middleware that doesn't send a response. Okay, so again, routes are a special type of middleware that sends a response. And when a response happens, that's when the server stops doing its job. So that request is satisfied when a response is sent. The browser's gotten what they got back. That particular response is now, that request response cycle is completed. So hopefully this has helped you understand the building of a server. My name's Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.